Good morning. The next to the last lesson of the year, lesson 119, completing the square. So I'm going to need you to take some pretty good notes on this lesson. You can write them in your own words. I'll tell you what steps that we're using, and you can write them in a language that you'll be able to understand. So we're on page 497. We're going to start with this quadratic. And it says to solve by completing the square. Now, right now, the only way that we can solve a quadratic is by factoring it and setting each factor equal to 0. So today we're going to learn another method that we can solve a quadratic. So the first thing you need to do is write it in descending order, means the highest exponent down to no exponent. We add 10x to both sides, set it equal to 0. All right, and we isolate the constant. Remember, the constant is the number that does not have a variable with it. So to isolate it means we need to subtract it from both sides. So it's over there isolated all by itself. So we have x squared plus 10x equals -6. Okay? The next thing we do is we take half of the middle coefficient. Middle meaning there's one, there's a middle, and there's on the other side. So the middle coefficient is 10. I pull it off to the side and I take half of it, which means I multiply it by 1/2. That's equal to 5. And with that 5, I square that. Okay, so I squared this result. 5 squared is 25. I take this 25 and I add it to both sides of the equation. So plus 25 and plus 25. What I do to one side of the equation, I must do to the other side. Otherwise, we've completely changed the equation. This way, we're just putting it in a format that we can work with. So now, this is a perfect square, guys. And it will always factor like this. Don't forget to put the square on here. The square root of your first term goes right here. Whatever sign this is in the middle goes right here. And then the square root of this term goes right here. And over here, we simply add -6 plus 25 is 19. All right. Now, some of these problems, I think we may have looked at how to solve these, maybe not. When we get to this point, we need to get the square root of x squared. So what we're going to do is take the square root of both sides. So we take the square root of this and the square root of this. But anytime we take the square root of a number, just a number, remember we get plus and minus. So when we take the square root of a square, okay, remember that's square root of a square, the radical just drops off. Okay, so it's x plus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 19. And then the last step is to go ahead and solve for x. So to solve for x means we need to get rid of this plus 5, which means we subtract 5 from both sides. And we'll get x equals -5 plus or minus the square root of 19. And that's the answer. So that's two values. That's -5 plus the square root of 19 and -5 minus the square root of 19. Because remember, in the factoring problems, we would get two parentheses, which would each give us an answer, which would give us two answers for a quadratic. All right, next one on page 498. Let's see how good your notes are. So I'm going to copy it down the way it is in the book. However, if this was me and I was writing this out of the book, I wouldn't copy it that way. I'd go ahead and put it in descending order. So it'd be x squared, add the 5x to both sides. So plus 5x plus 3 equals 0. And then what did we say to do next? Isolate the constant, right. So that means we're going to subtract 3 from both sides. So x squared plus 5x equals -3. Anybody remember what we said to do next? The middle coefficient is 5, isn't it? So that'd be 5 times 1/2, which is 5/2. And what did I say to do to that 5/2? I said to square it, didn't I? So 5/2 squared is 25/4. And what do we do with that? We add it to both sides. So plus 25/4 here and plus 25/4 here. And I can hear you guys through the computer growling because you love working with fractions so well, but that's too bad, okay? Not everything comes out to be a whole number. All right, so remember, this is now a perfect square, okay? That's the whole purpose behind completing the square, so that we make it a perfect square. So the square root of this goes here, this sign goes here, and the square root of this goes here. And over here, we just add and get a common denominator, so that would be 4 times -3 is -12 plus 25. So x plus 5/2 quantity squared equals 13/4. Now what? How do we get rid of this square right here? That's right, we take the square root of both sides. X plus 5/2 equals plus or minus the square root of 13/4. All right, so this right here, I know what the square root of 4 is. What is it? It's 2, right? So we're going to go ahead and subtract 5/2 from both sides, but when we rewrite this, we're going to put minus 5/2 plus or minus the square root of 13, but we're taking that square root of 4 out of the denominator, so it becomes 2. Remember in the lesson day before yesterday, we can't leave a radical in the denominator anyway, so if that wouldn't have come out as a perfect square, we would have had to do something to get rid of it. So nicely enough, square root of 4 came out perfectly as 2, so that's the answer. All right, last one in this lesson. It says complete the square. Okay, now like I told you, I'm going to go ahead and say that that's what the problem is instead of copying it the way it was in the book. In other words, I go ahead and subtract 3x from both sides before I get started. All right, so middle coefficient is 3. It doesn't matter that it's negative because ultimately we're going to square this number. And when you square the number, what do you get? You get a positive. Okay, so we're not going to worry about the sign. It's just the coefficient. So 3 times 1/2 is 3/2. And we square that 3/2, so we get 9/4. Should have taken that over first, and I didn't. Sorry about that. All right. So we're going to add 9/4 here and add, I'm going to have to make some room here. -1 plus 9/4. Okay, so what's the next step that we do? We've got to write it in factored form. Okay, so remember, this is a perfect square. Square root of this goes here. This sign goes here. And the square root of 9/4 is 3/2. Okay, we get a common denominator here. That's a 4. So 4 times -1 is -4 plus 9. So that's x minus 3/2 quantity squared is equal to 5/4. And how do we get rid of this square? we take the square root of both sides. So when we take the square root of both sides, remember, we get a plus and a minus on a number. So this will be x minus 3 over 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 5 over 4. And again, what's the square root of 4? It's 2. Okay, so we're going to add 3/2 to both sides. So that'll be x equals 3 over 2 plus or minus, but instead of writing that 4 there, we're going to say that's the square root of 5 over, what's the square root of 4? 2, that's right. All right, so that's completing the square. And in tomorrow's lesson, we're going to use completing the square to actually develop the quadratic formula, which is the other method that we'll have to solve quadratic equations. So you can't just forget about completing the square. It's not going away. All right, guys, have a good day.